Hi, welcome everyone. My name's Tracy Gray. I'm part of the Open Access Australasia Organising Committee for the International Open Access Week webinars that you're involved with this week. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. So Open Access Australasia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Today, I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and the Niagara people of the unceded lands where I work and live here in Meanjin, Brisbane. And we also pay our respects to all Indigenous peoples wherever they are in the world, including Tanangtha Whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And please feel free to add your own acknowledgements in the chat. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. This session will be recorded and it will be shared later after the end of this week. And we do ask you to mute your microphone unless you have something to talk after the panel session. And now I'd like to introduce Jess Howie, our host for today from the University of Waikato, and she'll be doing the opening karakia. Thank you.
Kia ora, Tracy. Ingo hoa mahi, whai a te mātauranga kia marama. Kia whai take ngā mahi katoa, tu maia, tu kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou e tātou katoa, haumi e, hui e, taiki e. Kia ora everybody and welcome. I'm going to begin by introducing myself. Ko Jess Howie tōku ingoa. He kaimahi o ke te iho o te Manawataki, te whare pukapuka o te whare wānanga o Waikato. Ko taupo te whenua tupu e noho kei Morrinsville Hau e noho ana ina nei. E mihi ana ki te iwi me te whenua o te haua, te whenua manaki i aho. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Jess Howie. I work at the University of Waikato as the Assistant Director for Open Research and Teaching and Learning, and I used our new ingoa Māori there, our new Māori name, Te Iho o Te Manawataki, which we're very proud of. I come from Taupo, where I grew up, but I now live in Morrinsville in the North Island, and I live on the lands of the Te Haua people. And it's a pleasure to be facilitating this panel today, which I'm very excited to do because it's a topic that's really, really close to my heart. The first thing I want to do is just acknowledge that we are missing one of our panelists today. Unfortunately, Elliot was unable to join us at short notice, but we are very excited to be working with 3 remaining panelists today. One is a recorded contribution, which we will be beginning with. Following that, I will be introducing our other 2 panelists, and we will be moving into our discussion from there. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our recorded contribution from Caroline Edwards. So Professor Caroline Edwards is Professor of Contemporary Literature and Culture at Birkbeck, University of London, and Executive Director of the Open Library of Humanities. She's author of Utopia and the Contemporary British Novel, editor of the Cambridge Companion to British Utopian Literature and Culture since 1945, and co-editor of China Mieville Critical Essays and Maggie G Critical Essays. Caroline is writing her second monograph, Hopeful in Humanism, The Elemental Aesthetics of Eco-Catastrophe. I did have to practice that one. Caroline is also widely known as an open access advocate, having co-founded the Open Library of Humanities with Professor Martin Eve in 2013. She's currently leading a team of 12 staff at the Open Library of Humanities, expanding the publisher's portfolio of leading humanities journals and overseeing the growth of their open source publishing platform, Janeway. In 2025, Caroline founded the Open Journals Collective, an international collective of academics, librarians, and university-based publishers. The OJC will launch in 2026 with Diamond Open Access Journal portfolios in arts, humanities, and social sciences, as well as science, technology, engineering, and maths. So we will now play Caroline's contribution.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to submit a pre-recorded presentation. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person, but being in the UK is a totally different time zone. So I was asked to present something reflecting on ideas of community ownership, thinking about the concept of knowledge ownership within community and collective contexts. And what I thought I'd do is talk you through this new project called the Open Journals Collective in relation to ideas of collaboration and shared knowledge ownership. So for folks who've never come across me before, my name is Professor Caroline Edwards. I am an academic professor based at Birkbeck in the University of London in the UK, and my background is in contemporary literature and utopian philosophy. But I've also been working in open access publishing since 2012. And I co-founded the Open Library of Humanities with my friend, Professor Martin Eve. The Open Library of Humanities was, I think I'm right in saying, one of the first diamond open access publishing initiatives which established a library membership model. So we asked a large number of libraries to support us with an annual membership pledge of a small amount, and that paid for the digital publishing costs of journals that are diamond open access. It wasn't called Diamond in those days. It was called Open Access without article processing charges. And we set up because we were, as humanities scholars, we were very cross at the idea of article processing charges, and we felt that they were fundamentally unfair and inequitable. And I think in the 10 years since we launched OLH in 2015, that has proven to be the case. So at OLH, we publish, I think the latest number is 34 journals in the humanities and social sciences. And over the years, what I've really found is that when you're bringing journals over into a community ownership model, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to challenge academics' understanding of legacy publishing. So what I mean is we don't own the intellectual property of any of the journals that the Open Library of Humanities publishes. And this is actually becoming increasingly common with diamond open access publishers. So unlike a traditional university press, when we sign a journal on, we give over the rights to the IP, which includes the journal title, the branding, the archive, and so on. That belongs to a scholarly community. And that can be really hard to define because in some cases there is perhaps a subject association that has a legal identity that has been incorporated. So in the UK, it might be a charity. There's a model in Holland, in the Netherlands, called the Dutch Stichting, which is a kind of non-profit organization. In the United States, I think they're called 501c3, which again is a sort of charitable legal structure. And so in those cases, it's easy to identify kind of the legal ownership of the journal. But in most cases, academics don't know who owns their journal, and small scholarly societies don't have the kind of capacity and resources to actually set up a legal foundation. So this is something that I was thinking of increasingly in the last few years, and it sort of led me to think in more collaborative terms, which I'll come on to in a moment. But I just wanted to say something about community ownership of software. It's not enough for us to be thinking about the collective and community governance of academic content if we're not also critiquing and addressing issues of our publishing infrastructure, our software. And this was something that at the Open Library of Humanities, when we launched in 2015, we didn't have time. We had seed funding for just under 2 years, and it wasn't enough time to build our own infrastructure. But we were very clear from the start that we wanted to do this. We were quite skeptical about third-party providers that were independent at the time, but we thought they were vulnerable to commercial acquisition, which is ultimately what happened to the publisher we launched with, who provided the infrastructure, sorry. So in about 2018, we started building our own software, and we called it Janeway. And Janeway is an open source publishing infrastructure, a platform, but more than just being open source, it is copyleft licensed. And this is really important, and it doesn't get talked about, I think, enough when we address publishing and open access. A copyleft license means that anybody can come into our GitHub, they can come in and look at our code base, they can contribute to the code, they can make their own plugins, they can make their own modifications, with the strict provision that any modifications they make must themselves be openly licensed. So it's a legal protection under the AFIRO general license that ensures that code can't be privatized in the future. We've seen, for example, with things like open journals systems, that you can take an open infrastructure, you can then put a really pretty front end on it, you can kind of put some bells and whistles on, and then you can sell it as a commercial product. So we were really clear from the start that our open publishing must be supported by open infrastructure. And that is interesting in reflecting upon the way in which this infrastructure, it's not just technological, it is social. The maintenance, I mean, I don't need to tell any librarians this, but the maintenance of this content requires an enormous amount of ongoing commitment and labour from individuals and organisations. And much of this work currently is done in a voluntaristic context. So people are not often compensated for their labour. When they're community governed systems, you're asking people to sit on community boards, you're asking them to volunteer their time to oversee the strategy, the orientation and the development of these infrastructures. At the Open Library of Humanities, we've tried to shift towards more of a human-centred approach, and this is only possible when an organisation gets to a certain size and you've got enough staff to be able to do that. And we've established our own community governance with regular communications and reporting and a biennial conference and so on. But let me move on then to two more examples before I talk about the Open Journals Collective. So one of the questions I was given in advance of this talk was examples of moving beyond individual authorship, which I find really fascinating. These are two journals that we publish at the Open Library of Humanities. So In Transition is the official video essay for the Society of Cinema and Media Studies, and they publish open peer review. And so publishing the peer review reader reports alongside the actual text of the video essays, so the transcription effectively of the video essays, has changed the way in which we think about knowledge production being community oriented. It's not possible to produce an article without the feedback of usually anonymous peer reviewers. So that's a very interesting example. And then the other one I picked out for you is the Journal of Embodied Research, which funnily enough is our other video essay journal. And this one is interesting because it's about performance. So often the video essays will feature a musician, a dancer, a choreographer, an athlete, somebody in kind of sports science. And they insist on equal authorship rights for every person who is featured in the video essay. So you can end up with multiple authors, which obviously is much more common in STEM subjects, but in the humanities where I work, we still have predominantly a single authorship model. So those are just two examples. Okay, so building on all of this work I've been doing at the Open Library of Humanities, it became very clear that transformative agreements, article processing charges, and read and publish deals are unaffordable and unfair, particularly in the UK, where we have a protracted funding crisis right now. And so I started talking with my library board members about, can we come up with a better community-led model for publishing open access? Can we make it cost effective because we're not having to give profits to shareholders? Can we prove that this is scalable, that rather than a monopoly of single commercial entities, we could scale with dozens of university-based publishers into an alternative kind of package? Can we prove that this is sustainable by supporting the divestment of library budgets away from commercial models for read and publish deals, and rather reinvesting money so that it stays within the university ecosystem, it doesn't get extracted out into surplus value? And then, of course, it needs to be mission aligned. We need to be working with rather than against our librarians. And this is where the Open Journals Collective was born. It's an international collective of scholars, libraries, and university-based publishers. We believe that research should be available to all, with no author fees and no paywalls. So who are the folks who helped me build the Open Journals Collective? We are academics, so authors, editorial boards, scholarly societies and associations. We are librarians, library directors, subject librarians, open research specialists, and both of those groups stand united against the commercialisation of academic research. And we're also publishers, university presses, library-based publishing programs, and scholarly associations who collectively have decades of experience of innovation in digital publishing at the highest standards, and are also committed to integrating these journals into a system of open infrastructure, which places our values above profits. We're launching in January 2026 with a collection of around 300 journals across the arts and humanities, and also into STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths. We have a few highlights here, as you can see. Some of these journals date back more than a century. Some of them have archives that date back many decades. Others are newer journals coming out of the late 1990s and early 2000s in maths online publishing, for example, or more recent flips. So journals that have left commercial providers such as Wiley, Springer Nature, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, and have moved into community-led diamond publishing models. Here are just a few of the features. I won't read all of them because I think I'm probably running short of time, but you're welcome to view the slides, which I will share with the organisers. So all of the latest publishing standards that you would expect, robust archiving in at least 2 approved services. Journals are indexed in the Directory of Open Access Journals, which is the kind of standard setting for our community, with usage data available. Libraries can go and check which of their authors are publishing in these journals. And then if they're interested in investing in the Open Journals Collective, they can make an evidence-based investment. These are just some of the publishers that we have so far. These are the ones who gave me permission to share their logos before we've launched, but there are many others as well. So it includes folks like the Open Library of Humanities, where I work, the University of California Digital Libraries e-Scholarship Program, the University of Michigan Press's MPub program, ERIDI, the Canadian consortium of Diamond Open Access journals. And then in the UK, we have UCL Press and LSE Press, and also Edinburgh Diamond based up at the University of Edinburgh. And just to finish, just to give you a sense of the kind of the community and collaborative nature of this project, it is international. Our partners are based in the United States, Canada, across Europe, with some interest as well in Australasia. I'm pleased to say we are building a community governance model based on years of experience with colleagues at the Open Book Collective, who have developed and demonstrated that this can work long term. We are building our own community hub, so that one of the things I'm most excited about is if we bring our shared experiences together, we can make such a powerful collective voice. We can prove that these journals are mission aligned, that they are far more sustainable. The digital infrastructure is more sustainable because it's more distributed. It is actually safer to things like cyber attacks, which the major commercial publishers are facing increasingly. And also, of course, we can bring our editors together in communities of practice, and we can all learn from each other whilst advocating collectively for a better future for non-profit publishing. Those are my slides. Thank you so much for your attention.
Just to express our gratitude to Caroline. It's really difficult for us to get perspectives from the other side of the world because of the tremendous time difference. So I'm really glad that we had that input from her. I know there would have been questions. I've got questions in my head, so it's a bit of a shame that we won't have her to bounce those off, but I think she introduces a really valuable perspective into this. Without further ado, I'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Kitty West. Dr. Kitty is an Indigenous researcher, kaupapa Māori theoriser, communication lecturer, and a reluctant storyteller. Her primary field of research is Māori data sovereignty, with a focus on how tikanga Māori can guide the governance, use and futures of data. This encompasses the responsibilities of institutions such as universities and government agencies, as well as the aspirations of iwi, hapu and Māori communities for data that upholds mana and mauri. She concentrates on questions of institutional accountability, Indigenous models of governance, and the ways Māori values can be embedded into digital and technological systems. Currently, her work explores both national and international approaches to Indigenous data governance, situating Māori experiences within a broader global context. Her research seeks to transform how data is understood and managed in Aotearoa and beyond, ensuring Māori voices and tikanga shape the paradigms and practices of data governance. So I will hand over to you, Dr. Kitty West.
Nā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you, Jess, for that introduction. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. And hope that that works. Can everyone see?
That's perfect,
Yeah.
thanks.
Oh, ka pai. Ko e tēnei wahine e mihi atu ana. Ko Kiri tōku ingoa he uri tēnei no parehauraki whānui, ko Ngāti Maru, Ngāti Tamatera, me Ngāti Whanaunga o ku iwi. I am a lecturer in communication, as Jess has already said in my intro. But it's really great to be here to be able to share some of the work that I'm doing. So thank you all for joining in online. And thank you as well to the organisers for inviting me into the conversation and giving me the opportunity to share my research and also just reflect on some, I guess, broader thoughts and perspectives on what is a really kind of important area around who owns knowledge. So as I was preparing this talk, I kind of kept coming back to the theme of today's discussion, who owns knowledge. And I've been thinking about how I can frame the work that I do in Māori data sovereignty in a way that speaks meaningfully to that question. So I really appreciate that we've been encouraged to challenge the idea that is so deeply rooted in Western research institutions that knowledge can be owned by an individual or a research team or, by an institution themselves. Because for me, as a wahine Māori, a Māori woman working in the field that I do, it just doesn't sit right with me. I've previously done a lot of work around storytelling and sense making of Māori data sovereignty and done that in, I guess, collaboration with the stories that my great-grandmother had written for us as her whānau. So for me, I'm kind of acutely aware of how even knowledge that I'm kind of sharing that is informed by my personal experiences is also still not owned by me as an individual, as I'm kind of situated within a relational context, and that is kind of, I guess, structured around whakapapa. So for me, I think what's a more appropriate question is not around who owns knowledge necessarily, but really who has the authority, responsibility and accountability to that knowledge. And by extension, the communities we have the privilege of engaging with. And I think I'm likely preaching to the converted, really, because the reality is most of us who are engaged in research, or are engaging in this conversation, I guess, would agree that, of course, knowledge isn't ownable by an individual. But most of us who are engaged in research operate within systems where knowledge is treated as a commodity. It drives institutional prestige and research rankings and all of that fun stuff. And we have to be able to demonstrate that we have impactful, meaningful research in order to be able to get research funding, which is incredibly tricky in kind of the contemporary research environment. But this is, I think, where the logics of knowledge ownership show up really strongly. Even if you think from the first point of engagement with research participants or communities, we're essentially kind of asking through the consenting process for people to agree, for us to kind of collect their stories and then analyze, interpret, and share them in ways that kind of attach our names to them and present them as our own. And it was heartening to hear some of the work that Caroline presented around how we might look at that differently in terms of acknowledging authorship and publication. And I think I'm aware that while many researchers will be well-intentioned and want to kind of do the right thing in terms of acknowledging where knowledge comes from, that actually this can still be challenging when our values and what we think is right sits in tension with research norms and institutional requirements. And I guess this is where I see my work fitting in. So not around redirecting well-intentioned researchers to kind of do the right thing, but more kind of looking at what are the processes, tools, mechanisms within institutions that currently exist around Māori data sovereignty, and asking, do these structures truly support us to honour the knowledge, stories, and data that we've been entrusted with? Or do they simply reinforce systems of control and extraction? I'm just going to have to say I've heard a teenager walking into my house, so if there's noise, I do apologise about that. It's the joys of being a mum of four. But yeah, this kind of, I guess, brings me into the research project I'm currently working on, where I'm kind of looking specifically at Māori research data governance, and the broader project is about activating Māori data sovereignty within the university context. And this is a new piece of work which is funded by Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga, our Māori Centre of Research Excellence. And it's been carried out by a team of us across 3 different institutions. So we've got Dr. Paul Brown at the University of Waikato, myself at the University of Auckland, and Dr. Marie Sheehan at Te Whare Wānanga o Aotearoa. And we're all responsible for kind of covering off the objectives that are listed there on the screen. And I'm kind of focusing in on the governance side of it today. I think just to provide a bit of clarity around the language that I'm using, I want to kind of briefly walk through some key definitions, which I think are important to hold in mind as we move through this conversation. So the first one is Māori data. So I'm not going to read out the definitions of the screen. I'll kind of leave those for you to have a read through as I talk. But essentially, what we've seen is this increasing recognition and the linking of our definitions of Māori data to the protection of mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge. So thinking about data in a very broad way, which is important because Māori data sovereignty isn't kind of just concerned with data in the narrow, very technical sense. It is actually also concerned with knowledge, stories, and relationships that data comes from and the ways that data can inform, I guess, a new framing of knowledge as well. Then there's Māori data sovereignty, which I guess, depending on your kind of context that you're joining us from today, you might be more familiar with ideas around Indigenous data sovereignty, but really this is about recognising the inherent rights and interests of Indigenous people in the New Zealand context, Māori, to have control over the collection ownership and application of Māori data. So I think that that's really important. And then I think as well, just having that that key distinction between Māori data sovereignty and Māori data governance. So Māori data governance referring to the kind of principles and structures and legal instruments that enable Māori to exercise sovereignty over Māori data. And I think that's an important distinction to make because often when we talk about Māori data sovereignty or Indigenous data sovereignty, there's an assumption that it can be given effect by anyone. But I think when we're looking at institutions like universities that are not kind of Māori run or Indigenous led, it's really hard to make a claim that they can give effect to Māori data sovereignty, but they can kind of enable Māori data sovereignty through Māori data governance. So I think just speaking into those distinctions is quite important. It's also really important to take a moment and acknowledge the broader context that this work sits within. So not just necessarily what's on this slide. I think it's also important for me to kind of go back even further and acknowledge that these questions that we're discussing today are not new. Even if we looked at a kind of small field of research that's relevant to this question around intellectual property, and we think about the Mātātua Declaration in the kind of early 90s and the work of Aroha Mead, for example, and even kind of Barry Barclay talking about it in Mana Tūturu. Those are kinds of continuations or extensions of existing conversations that have been happening, for a long, long time. But for this research in particular, just wanting to kind of signal that it sits within a kind of international context where Indigenous communities have expressed concern and frustration at I guess, at the ways in which universities are continuing to fail us, specifically in their failure to affirm and uphold Indigenous data governance in a real or meaningful way. And that, I guess, idea that when institutions are failing to give effect to Indigenous data sovereignty, they're also kind of complicit in ongoing structures of colonialism. So I guess that's really important because if we recognize that kind of research institutions and the way that research has accumulated a particular status in Indigenous communities as being a dirty word, for example, then we recognize the way that research and knowledge have been used to, I guess, determine what is valued or legitimate knowledge. And that's I guess leans into that idea. If Indigenous peoples don't have control over our own data, then we also don't have control over how our stories are told or who gets to tell them. So I guess that's the critical context. So this research project and my objective in particular is focusing in on a particular case study from my own institution, Waipapa Taumatoro, the University of Auckland. And about 5 years ago, the university made a really bold aspirational statement in its strategic plan, Taumata Teitei, signalling an intention to become a Māori data sovereignty-led organisation. And I think this statement provides a really useful entry point for my research because it gives us something to engage with, something very concrete, and we can say, hey, you made this commitment. Where are we at now? What are we doing with it? And I also just want to make it really clear that while I am focusing on the University of Auckland, the issues that we're identifying in the research are not unique to our institution. In fact, much of what's emerging through the research reflects broader patterns across universities in Aotearoa. And what sets the University of Auckland apart is that and what makes them a really valuable case study is that they've actually put Māori data sovereignty in writing as a goal. Which gives us leverage and a starting point to explore what it means to operationalize that commitment within a complex institutional system, because it's very complex, is what I'm discovering as I kind of engage in the initial phases of this research. But essentially, it's just about the research is about upholding or holding institutions to account for the aspirations they publicly commit to, and using that as a pathway into broader systemic questions around governance and responsibility. We've kind of been analysing documents and frameworks to see what actually is in place since that kind of aspirational statement in 2020, I think it was. And what we're seeing is that while the intention is there, it's yet to be translated into coordinated, actionable practice. So the university did a kind of review of their research data management infrastructure, and Māori data sovereignty was identified as something of particular concern, and there were recommendations within the report around how we could progress our or move towards that kind of aspiration of being Māori data sovereignty led, and that involved developing a data capability maturity model. But since then, there's been a lot of activity in the space, but it is quite difficult to measure or understand the impact of that activity. So we're seeing a lot of references to Māori data sovereignty, but a lack of cohesion or clear kind of understanding about what that means and what responsibilities that creates for researchers. So, researchers are encouraged to kind of have a look at Māori data sovereignty when they're developing their research proposals, for example, or data management plans. But the landing page for where researchers would find information about how to do that still kind of speaks to quite abstract principles with very little guidance on how to action that. So that's kind of knowledge and implementation gap that exists currently. What we're looking to do now is kind of map the Māori research data ecosystem and just to understand really where data is sitting, who can access it, and where governance opportunities exist. Our goal really is to shift from good intentions to real implementation. And what we see as part of that is kind of developing practical steps and tools for researchers and in particular researchers who are not Māori but interested in engaging in this space, because my fear is that I become, the go-to person. If you have a policy that says you have to engage with Māori data sovereignty or Māori data governance, and people need to find out how to do that, essentially what it means is a workload burden for people who have expertise in the space. And so how can we kind of reduce that so that people are not pulled away from their own work to kind of feed into and be supplementary resource for other people? We're in a really good spot in Aotearoa, I guess, with 7 out of 8 universities referencing Māori data sovereignty and speaking to the significance. And I guess the research is well positioned to have meaningful impact in terms of being able to develop practical guidance that will support researchers. And I guess the other thing we're interested in is how do we enable accountability within the system? Because so much of the work that we do in this space rests on the shoulders of people who want to do the right thing, as I mentioned earlier, but our institutions are the ones who are responsible for, I guess, providing the structure and the infrastructure to be able to make that meaningful in practice. So I guess just to close, I'll leave a few quick reflections that universities must go beyond symbolic commitments. And that recognition is a start, but it isn't the same as accountability. Māori data governance isn't a technical fix necessarily. It's a way to give effect and to tino rangatiratanga for Māori. And our project is about building the real tools, frameworks, and mechanisms needed to shift power. So there's a lot that I probably could have gone into, and I probably already went over time. But yeah, really happy to kind of take questions. And if there are gaps or anything that anyone thinks I can speak into or maybe be informed about based on your knowledge base, then I would be really open to hearing any whakaaro or ideas from the people in the room. So yeah, ngā mihi nui. Thank you for listening.
Kia ora, Kiri. That was really, really, really interesting. And man, your thoughts about bridging the best intentions to practice really, really resonate. And I love how there was a common theme between your talk and Caroline's around the structures and the sort of systems that are behind and what can be problematic about those. So thank you very much. I know people will have questions. Just a reminder, please engage in the chat or in the Q&A. We'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Kitty. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Alice McSherry. She's an Indigenous geographer, Nashi Chinese Pakeha New Zealander, working at the nexus of cultural and ecological revitalisation. She also serves as the kaiwhakatere or navigator of the Waiheke Marine Project, a place-based collaboration between local community and mana whenua to protect and regenerate the marine environment of Waiheke Island, Aotearoa. The Waiheke Marine Project runs several concurrent projects, two of which, the annual Coda Dive Survey and Kelp Gardeners, actively seek to weave scientific knowledge, mātauranga Māori, and local insights into biodiversity restoration. As part of these projects, there's a common aspiration to create open source data sets that are collectively generated and owned in place to support the revitalisation of Māori in Te Kapa Moana or the Hauraki Gulf. I'll hand over to you, Alice.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Jess, for the beautiful introduction, and kia ora koutou. I am Alice, as Jess mentioned, and it's a real pleasure to be here and share some insights, I guess, on this very important topic of who owns, or whether knowledge is even ownable, which I really liked your challenge there, your whittle there, Kitty. I'm going to take things a little bit down I was going to say a garden path, but it's probably down the path to the beach, and kind of highlight I guess the work that we do with the Waiheke Marine Project. I'm going to do the whole share some slides thing as well. Make sure I've got this. Oh, continue to share. Yes, continue to share. All right. Apologies for that. Yes, so as Jess mentioned, the Waiheke Marine Project is I guess I always talk about it as a complex beastie. I'll start by means of introducing the project a little bit more broadly, and then we'll kind of come into some of the active projects and how we might be embodying, I think, knowledge generation at the community scale, at place, for a common love of the marine environment, but acknowledging that it's not just love, it's also a necessity of our survival as island people in place. So the Waiheke Marine Project is, as I said, a bit of a complex beastie. It emerged at the end of 2020, after some false starts with COVID, but it started with this thing called the Future Search, which is essentially a collaborative planning process that gets all of the voices in the room that are kind of joined on a shared kaupapa or mission. And that mission for us was protecting and regenerating the Māori of Waiheke's immediate marine environment, recognizing that this was a gigantic task that has traditionally had many silos in it. I think, we can all agree that we want healthy, abundant ecosystems around us. And that was obviously not necessarily happening because, again, I think some of and excuse me, I was about to just say it out there, but essentially the constipation of agencies needing to take charge, or institutions needing to hold certain knowledge that was the best practice. And we said, actually, hang on a minute, I think the solution is actually in place already, and that is really held, the expertise is actually held with the people that are putting their bodies in the ocean every single day. What better to, again, not an appropriate word, mine, not to extract, but acknowledge, I guess, the inherent capacity that we held on island. So through this Future Search process, 9 key voices that were identified, I guess, as the core voices. I'm going to call them voices, not stakeholders, because that's another dirty word. But the voices that had something to do with the marine environment. Now, these were voices like the mana whenua voice, local voices, youth voices, the voices of agencies as well, noting that they had a very big role to play in terms of our policy implementation, scientists who are working on the marine ecosystem, marine business as well, recognizing that Waiheke Island, for those of you who don't know it, I think Lonely Planet called us the fourth best island in the world to visit. Not that I like to say that because we're inundated with tourists over the summer season, but yeah, we have a very unique, I think, biodiverse context that we're working with that is increasingly, I guess, at under threat, really, with all sorts of manner of kind of environmental degradation, shall I say, and also kind of social pressures. Anyway, so I was sorry, this is all very on the fly, and I can go on tangents, so I need to rein myself in a little bit. So basically what emerged out of this process was, hey, let's do some of that kind of coordinated response. We know that the silos exist. How do we bridge them? How do we honour the local voices? How do we honour, again, mana whenua, our Indigenous folks here and their mātauranga, noting, of course, that Waiheke, being part of the larger suburban sprawl that is Auckland in New Zealand, has a really unique context, I think, with a real, gentrification has gone mad on the island. We cannot, our demographics have shifted significantly in the last kind of since colonization. So we're seeing we're at a point where, our relationships and ways of knowing what constitutes the Waiheke demographic have changed vastly as well. So these are all kind of pressures and realities, I think, of our contemporary time meets a degraded environmental situation. We have a bit of a challenge on our hands. Anyway, so through this future search process, we came into the room. I think it was 76 people turned up. And 3 days of a really intense wānanga, basically, nutting out what it is that we could agree on, because, of course, a very polarizing topic, believe it or not, is saving our planet. Apparently that's polarizing these days. But anyway, so we essentially whittled down over this three-day period a set of 9 common ground commitments, and every 76 of those people in that room walked away saying, okay, we're committing to these 9 things, 9 commitments. These 9 commitments are on our website, and I'll leave our website at the end if you want to kind of have a little bit more of an explore about what we do. Anyway, so our whakatauki for our project was gifted by Ngāti Paoa Kaumatua at the beginning of the future search, Waiheke ki uta, Waiheke ki tai, Waiheke ki tua, so Waiheke basically from the mountains to the sea and beyond, recognizing that the center of any decision making really about the revitalization of our ecology had to be centered at place and be informed by what was emergent here. So what emerged was this project that I am so honoured to, I guess, be the navigator of the kaiwhakatiri of, alongside my Ngāti Paoa kaiwhakatiri as well. So we operate on a co-leadership model. And essentially I put this up here because we used the kete as our kind of relational governance structure as we were moving forward, noting that there were 6 kind of key backbone threads that made up the project, of course, one of them being knowledge. And I think I'm going to just scale into that for the purposes of today. So with all of our, I'm going to go back, our knowledge kind of, our threads, what has emerged, understanding that the kete is what the backbone kind of holds, and then within the kete or the basket, we have our little individual projects or actions, and these we call pipi, acknowledging that some pipi might be small, baby fledgling ones, some might be bigger, more mature, delicious pipi that we can snack on. So some of the examples of the work that we do, of course, I'm going to talk mostly about the Kauro Dive Survey, which is one of our flagship big juicy pipis in the kete. We're now 5 years into running, I think what is officially Aotearoa's largest underwater citizen science project. I'm going to take that as a win. So progressively over the last 5 years, we've managed to put, I think, year on year, around about 100 volunteer divers in the water over 4 weeks or 4 weekends. And this largely started, and I'm just going to check what my next, oh yeah, I'm going to give you guys a coda. So the coda dive survey. Coda is Te Reo Māori for the crayfish or the red spiny lobster, which lives not so abundantly today, but once did in all throughout Te Kapo Moana, Te Moana Nui a Toi. So the Coda Dive Survey emerged again as a need. It was a locally driven thing that said, hey, we don't have local data about our crayfish. We do know from various scientific reports that Coda are quote unquote functionally extinct in the Hauraki Gulf. And this essentially means that they are still there, but they're just not at the levels that are required to successfully reproduce and maintain a healthy population in the Gulf. At the same time, of course, where we sit in Aotearoa fisheries is managed at a massive scale. Of course, New Zealand has, I think, the 4th largest EEZ of fisheries in the world. Meets some of the lowest protection, marine protection in the world, and we've got, again, a challenging situation on our doorstep. So the Coda Dive Survey was really spearheaded by our steering group in 2021, and it said it was in response to a local rahui that was laid by Ngāti Pawa Iwi Trust at the time. And a rahui is a customary protection tool that essentially says that there is no take of, at the time it was 4 species, it still is 4 species today, Coda being one of them, Pawa, abalone, tipa, scallops, and kutai mussels. So there's a no take of those 4 species in a 1 nautical mile range of wrapping around the entire coastline of Waiheke Island. So to date, that actually translates as the biggest protected area, believe it or not, at present operating for those particular species. So what we wanted to know was, okay, we say that we want to protect it. Here's a mechanism that's protecting our marine ecosystem. Now, how do we know if the protection's even working? So this Coda Dive Survey was really born as a means of mobilizing some in-person experiential data to go down underwater and actually, for lack of a better word, count the coda that were living on our shore, in our near shore reef systems. Now that was a really depressing thing to do. I think the first year we counted a grand total of 20 coda. When we have mātauranga stories that tell us about these intense marches that used to happen only a few generations ago, where there's stories of them en masse, millions and millions of coda marching along the sea floor of the Hauraki Gulf, from Aotea all the way to Waiheke, because we are known as, a very significant hotspot for them to spawn in at various times of the year. So going from that 70 years ago to the fact that we have mobilized a group of local divers, local community divers and mana whenua divers, and to, over a whole survey season, only discover that there were 20 coda seen, was a bit depressing. And I think those numbers have relatively stayed the same, acknowledging that coda themselves have a 7-year reproductive cycle. So actually we don't really know huge amounts until we kind of hit that 7-year mark and get a longer data set. Anyway, I digress. What we really found out year on year doing this, and this fed into the mission, and I've just added a few fun photos. I'm doing fun photo show and tell presentation rather than anything too specific, and I will answer questions and link this stuff to the more theoretical conversation that we're having today. But what we really found out was, still when we put the call out to volunteers to participate in a Coda Dive survey, a lot of them were actually the scientific community coming in, volunteering, and we still had a real dearth of local voices. So we stood up another PIPI at the same time to train our local people in diving, and then use the Coda Dive survey to kind of enhance capacity on island to get people under the water, skilled up in diving, but also skilled up in survey methods as well, so that they could embody and understand what it actually feels like to be a steward and participant in our local ecosystems, and of course count some Coda. So the conversation around knowledge, I guess, is quite a complex one, because on the one hand we can say, okay, the number of Coda, the number of, X transect of successful, kelp restoration is happening, or we can count this many kinner, and, we can have our ecosystems turned into numbers or verifiable kind of facts, or we can engage in this whole kind of restoration of relationship of people with place. And I think that's where the piece that's really beautiful to think about now when we're talking about this topic is, well, what is knowledge? Because knowledge is the lived, the embodied experience of knowing one's place so well, so that we have the kind of substance of the stories that then eventually kind of along the generations give us snapshots of how these places operate. So I'm cycling through some photos. Here are some underwater snaps of our latest survey, and I believe, Jess, you were actually one of our volunteer divers, so thank you for getting in the water with us. We every year we have a whole bunch of new people that are really interested in the kaupapa, and I think, cycling back to the kind of main topic of conversation here, what we're seeing now 5 years in is that we've got this data set that is, of course, totally open source. We share it with the community. It's all on our website. Everything is all reported, and shared actively. Beyond obviously the stories that happen when you're having yarns with everybody. But what's really interesting now is that this was a real hard sell in the first few years. But now that we've kind of gained enough momentum, that we've got a data set that's spanning 5 years, we're actually getting kind of MPI, the fisheries people coming to us and saying, hey, hang on, this is actually really interesting, and this is actually really valuable data that you guys have. Can we have it? And we're like, hang on a minute. Well, you can, because it's open source, but hang on a minute. there's some interesting power dynamics to play. So I really thank you. Hats off to you, Kitty, for speaking to the kind of institutional constraints of what happens when knowledge is gatekept, I think, in the institutions. So these are just, again, some more photos of our team going down there. For those of you who don't know the Hauraki Gulf, or actually globally, there's a real problem with kinner sea urchin barrens at the moment, which effectively means that all of our underwater world is essentially just like it's a desert. It's rocks with a whole bunch of sea urchins, and that's generally related to the fact that their predators have been overfished, and one of their main predators is of course the Coda. So this is a spot on the northern coastline of Waiheke, where you can see some of the kelpers coming back, because of course we've got a concurrent project that goes manually removing kinner from these spaces to ease the pressure on the seaweed that's growing underwater. So of course, with more seaweed, you're seeing more complex habitats return to our coastlines. And of course, more Coda are coming back, because of course they can actually survive and hide and spawn and do all of the things that Coda want to do. So again here, so every time we send our volunteers down with waterproof survey papers, they go down and record their observations. This kind of really harks back to that conversation around knowledge as being generated and emergent, and owned, actually, owned, if you can call it that, owned or experienced through actively participating in the environment around you. And this is particularly, I think, important when we're talking about ecological restoration. Now, these are just a few photos from our latest community data share event, because I'm aware that time rocks by and tangents can happen. I think a really important part of the way that the Waiheke Marine Project operates, I mentioned that we were a co-led kind of partnership between mana whenua on island and also our local community. So we have a ropu, or a group, called Ngāti Pauaki Waiheke, and they're really, every year, there's a lot of huia whānau and wānanga that bring, I guess, mātauranga experts again, said with a grain of salt, in to share knowledge and really start thinking about how they, as a ropu of grounded kaitiaki, can actually enhance their own understandings in the context of te ao hurihuri, or the changing world, to not only keep telling these stories, but also what happens when, you know, context has changed and there has been a loss of the story and a disconnection. How do we then recover some of these methods of being with the environment that we're in? So there's currently a bit of work with our ropu of Ngāti Pauaki Waiheke, tracking our maramataka that is Hauraki Gulf specific, of course, and there's been some really fascinating trends that are emerging. This is Isabella showing some of the data that was found, and it's really interesting to then compare that to Ao Pūrako and other knowledge from their kaumatua, and seeing what lines up. Again, real emphasis on, I think, creating the conditions upon which knowledge can be shared safely, and creating the conditions upon which we can have reciprocal learning in a safe way that's not, again, being commercialized or locked away again in these complex institutional ways. Anyway, so those are some photos, some photos of our panel. Our lovely graphic designer and our team put together this really beautiful image up on the top. I think it's the top right for me, might be the top left for you. It's just showing all of the different moon phases that we went on a dive. We went diving on this year. Some of the different species that were reported as being seen. So we have an updated image. This is, of course, all on the website and actively shared with whoever's keen to know. And yeah, really honoring the fact that this is living knowledge. Knowledge is only created and generated through living and being in place, and that's kind of some of the real work that we really want to get behind. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this, and I'm happy to answer questions because I'm sure there's stuff that I've missed out, but yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. And there's our website. And we'll leave it at that. Cool.
Kia ora, Alice, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I don't think there's ever been a series of talks that have aligned so much with my personal interests. Yeah, to hear about the work that's going on in research data management, moving that to practice alongside moving against transformative agreements and Diamond Open Access, and then this amazing project that I've had the privilege to be a part of it. And I think just to share a little bit about that experience as a volunteer diver is one of the things we were encouraged to do, is really when we were doing the surveys to really be present in what we were doing, record observations outside of just the coda and the other species that were of interest, but to actually take the time to connect with place, as you described. And what it meant for me was really it brought a new facet of my understanding in terms of like, what are we even doing when we're creating this knowledge and what's happening to it and how is it being produced? Which is why I was so excited to see this combination come together, and I think it has come together really beautifully. I'm going to ask one question off the basis of that. I can see we've had another question come through, but just to kick off, and I'll kick off with you, Kitty, so that you can catch your breath, Alice. What role should the communities who create or contribute to knowledge play in deciding how it is stored, shared, and used? Kitty, can I throw to that for you first?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for our project, our third objective, which I didn't really get to talk about, that is about community and connection and how do we ensure that whatever data is currently held by the university or is in the process of getting collected or in the future will be collected or, how do we ensure that iwi, whether or Māori, Hapori, whomever the community is, how do we ensure that that connection is maintained? So I think really that sits in that distinction between what is kind of Māori data sovereignty and what's Māori data governance. So the communities from where data is derived should have absolute authority and control over who has access to their information and their knowledge and their stories. And that's about enabling data sovereignty. And we need the university to support us with the infrastructure to support that because we know that we're working in, a fair environment where the expectation is that data is open, that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which in theory is fine, and in many ways could support Indigenous peoples to have greater access to the data that, as you mentioned, Alice, is often gatekept by institutions. So FAIR could kind of operate in a positive way, but not without kind of careful restrictions. So care meaning collective benefit, authority to control, respect and ethics. I think I've got the acronym correct there. So yeah, I think in my view, full kind of control and authority. And that is not something that should be determined by researchers or institutions or even the types of infrastructure that I'm suggesting we set up within universities. The decisions that are made around the types of controls that communities would like to have should be from, led from those communities. So that might look like Māori data sovereignty plans at a kind of iwi or hapu level. So kind of, I'm just noting that comment around the use of te reo Māori within our everyday speak. So at the tribal or kind of sub-tribe level, or when it's not kind of iwi or hapu specific at the kind of community level, what might a governance group look like that kind of ensured that in an ongoing capacity, knowledge, data, stories shared and maintained and protected in ways that are aligned with the, I guess, aspirations, needs and desires of the community from which it comes. So, yeah.
Thanks, Kitty. I'm interested in your take on this, Alice, particularly with the contact that you have with the community. So the question was around the role that the community should create or contribute to the knowledge and deciding how it's stored, shared, and used. But like I say, I'm also interested in how are those communities responding to the work you're doing in this space when you go back out and engage?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's met it's met by a whole range of emotions, quite frankly. Mostly because we don't tend to have it's interesting because then we start thinking about what is knowledge actually in the first place, because the numbers are really deeply depressing, right? That we're coming back to. And I think somehow because there's this embodied aspect of daylighting almost the fact that embodied knowledge does count, and it doesn't have to be kind of third party verified in this kind of institutional manner, that every person's observations actually count, and that is making making the weave and the of what is known on the island. So then that is the hopeful bit, right? That's the part that I think people can suddenly say, oh, on the one hand, okay, our populations are doing really, doing really badly, but actually look at what is being how the kind of weave is responding to that, knowing as well that when we start having the conversations with the biologists and the scientists and the marine biologists, who are then able to explain, life cycles of the coda and these kind of more, technical aspects, that suddenly starts to make sense in terms of how we as the humans belong within a larger system of knowing. And I think in that respect, people always come away super jazzed and super excited that they are also part of this movement, almost to create kind of this repository or repository of living data, because we have to ask what is data in the first place, and one of my favorite scholars, Vina Delorius Jr., Native American Sioux scholar, talks about, no data is irrelevant when we're when we're talking about our engagements with ecology, particularly in environmental issues. That and that kind of, I was thinking about this when I think it was Caroline was challenging kind of authority as well, and we're playing at the moment, a lot of our conversations around, well, how do we take that next step and say, well, hang on, what about the voice of the reef and the voice of the coda? And we are actually playing with a publication coming up, having Coda and Rimurimu as our first authors in a paper, because again, challenging and disrupting, I think, kind of status quo and business as usual, to give non-humans the voice that they require in terms of our restoration. That did not answer the question, and I got on a tangent, but
I love your tangents, Alice,
yeah.
but I think it did answer the question. And just to add, I remember in one of the dive briefings how somebody had described a coda that they'd spotted. And I remember them saying, I feel really protective over that individual coda. Like, I'm not going to tell anybody where I found that. Like, if somebody knew there was a couple of coda in this spot, they could come wipe out the population and all that progress is gone. But the sense of responsibility really resonated, which is so interesting.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you should reference Caroline's talk as well. So that's another thing I'd like to ask. I'll throw to you on this one, Kitty. Interested to hear, this is from the audience, I should say, interested to hear what commonalities you heard in Caroline's opening talk, which was obviously on the academic side with your own perspective. Kitty, would you like to start with that one?
Sure. It was actually quite interesting because before I was a lecturer, and actually before I got into Māori data sovereignty as my area of interest, I was a journal coordinator for an open access publication called My Journal, which is published by Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga and focuses on issues of relevance to Māori and Māori and Indigenous communities, I guess, but specifically in Aotearoa. So I could see that a lot of the conversations and things that Caroline was kind of bringing to the fore were things that we were kind of also talking about when I was working at and I think it was just quite interesting, when we've been doing planning hui with our kind of broader research team, we've also been thinking about, well, how do we acknowledge, I guess, when we are engaging with iwi and hapu, how do we ensure that in the way that we disseminate those findings, there's kind of things that we do at the community level, and then there's the things that we're required to do as part of our roles within universities. But the idea of putting our community partners as lead authors in our academic writing was kind of raised, and how do you acknowledge everyone that's kind of participated in the mahi. And I think it honestly like raises some questions for me because part of me thinks, of course, you have to acknowledge where knowledge comes from. That's good kind of academic practice. But it's also important in terms of the ma maintenance of relationships. But then I also have the question as well, like what value add is a name on a publication for a community member who, is fighting for their right to have their rights acknowledged, and their connection to knowledge acknowledged. How is their name on a publication useful? And it's not to say that we shouldn't do it. I think that we should, but it's interesting to think about the ways that the things that we kind of put so much emphasis into as academics, being the kind of publication stuff, because that's what we're paid to do, how that kind of is maybe a little bit out of touch with what our communities actually need. But I think, you know, what Caroline was talking about, I think there's a lot of potential there to build accountability mechanisms into open access publications. Maybe there's a way of also within that same realm developing like accountability checks to ensure that, whatever knowledge is being kind of published in whatever forum is aligned with, it might be Māori data sovereignty, but it might be kind of more broadly speaking, the care principles or something like that. Um, yeah, I'm not sure. I ran around in a few circles there trying to answer the question. So you have to interrupt and let me know if I'm going off topic. But yeah, I guess those are my kind of thoughts around.
Thank you for that.
Hmm.
Alice, I know you mentioned a parallel with Caroline's talk before, so feel free to comment on it, but I'd also like to throw another question to you, which was specifically mentioned around examples of how specific Māori knowledge or stories have informed your project. So you talked about the stories from the kaumātua of marching across the Kona, marching across the ocean floor. And they point out how motivating that seemed for you. But do you have any more comment around how things like that informed your approach?
Yeah, of course. I guess, it's hard. There are totally so many inspirational stories that come, particularly from our old people, the memories of mahinga kai that were abundant, once abundant, and um, connecting, I guess, the whole lived ethics that come from an abundant place, that we can kind of aspire to get back to that somehow. And I think the conversation almost sometimes gets sidelined when all this focus on kai, and you're like, well, actually kai is so central to, it's not just the act of eating, it's the act of reciprocity, it's the act of caring for one another, it's everything. It's baked into how we live well with each other on the planet, right? And so I think some of those stories become the kind of beacons of where we can maybe vision towards, knowing that our current kind of dilemma or our contemporary context makes it very difficult to get back to that place, of course, and we have to question of whether going back is necessarily the right move, or is it adapting in some way of having the past inform the future in a living way as well. But yeah, I think kind of on that abundant note, again, it's that experience of giving people the tools and necessary infrastructure, I think, to get in the water and experience this stuff for themselves. I think, again, it's that assumption almost that knowledge lives out there, that local people might not have verifiable knowledge and therefore contribute to things like fisheries management in this country, which is, don't even get me started. um, and saying, hey, actually, there is value in going for a dive, having a spiritual moment with the snapper, and coming back and reporting that, weaving those experiences into our story to then mend or reweave the social ecology that goes with the, non-human ecology that we're supposedly trying to protect. Again, it's all relational, right? And I'm a big advocate for knowledge is relational. End of story, really. I am known by my relations and everything. Yeah.
I love how
Scratching
you
moment with
talked
the snapper
about
was actually, sorry, I'm just just responding to that chat. It was actually a moment that I did have. It was my last dive before I had my daughter and had gone out to Enclosure Bay, which is where our kelp garden location is, and gone for my last dive, knowing that I was probably going to be in the newborn postpartum world for a while and not be able to get in the water, and this big granddaddy tamuri snapper just came and basically knocked on my snorkel goggles, and it was a moment, and we definitely had a moment. I think he's still hanging out with me.
I love that. That's so cool. I really loved how you talked about bodies in the water, both that, their experience of the environment and getting them in the water to do the research itself. So the next one's quite a big one that I'm sure you'll both have comment on. And we might be coming to time for maybe this one and maybe depending on how it goes, one more. So if you're looking to ask a question, please pop it in now. So for you both, and I'll throw to Kitty first. Do you worry about the misuse of things that you make openly, or is the openness itself a kind of safety net because it shares responsibility and increases transparency? So this one's a doozy, but I'll throw it out to you, Kitty, first.
Um, I think I think sometimes this is why the processes that we have in place currently in kind of institutional settings that are kind of they replicate a lot of like a contract-like relationship with participants. Um, I think this is where there is concern because, once you take kind of ownership or control over a person's story, which is the way that our structures are set up to do, it leaves little room or little opportunity for them to for our communities and our participants to uh, have a say over how kind of data or their knowledge or stories is shared. Um, so I would say openness is important because knowledge is something that should be shared, and I think there's this myth that knowledge or the value of knowledge is consumed by its use. Uh, so once you discover it for the first time, it's no longer kind of valuable. And I think actually it's probably more appropriate to think about the value add of having, many people engaging. And as you say, Alice, like what is the embodied kind of experience of knowledge? And um, in that sense, openness is kind of necessary, but it shouldn't just be like without any checks and balances. Because depending on whose hands kind of information or stories get into, it can have disastrous kind of implications for community. And I think, if you want a very clear example of that, it's one that's often referenced, and that's the Havasupai Nation and what happened to them. So, I mean, I guess that's a case study for people to look into in their own time. But what that was kind of showing is that all access all the time is not always good, and that actually it should be determined by the community how open and who has access and what controls might be in place to ensure that the knowledge and stories are protected.
I think the value of its knowledge is not consumed by its use is a really amazing point to make. Alice, do you have comment
Mm.
on that question?
Yeah, well, this is actually a really on topic conversation that we've had throughout kind of the question of what data do we actually end up sharing with the community knowledge, and kind of noting that not all people are necessarily benevolent in wanting to know numbers of a taonga species that dwells in our place. So kind of in our internal workings, we although we share the data openly, we have got a few checks and balances in terms of not disclosing specific GPS locations, for example, of where nests are that are found. We scale it out again, noting that it is a local survey that we do, but instead of saying the specific area that we found, it's along the northern coastline of Waiheke somewhere, and that kind of safeguards it in a little way where we're kind of treading that line, both understanding that the protection tools that we do have in place, it is a rahui. There are not everybody in this country respects a rahui, which is a whole nother conversation. Even if it is, we are the rahui, this particular rahui around Auckland, around Waiheke is backed up with legislation from the New Zealand government as well. So we're backed up with Section 186A of the Fisheries Act, which is a temporary closure of. So technically, we should have fisheries officers cruising around Waiheke, but of course that's Department of Conservation and Fisheries, they don't quite under-resourced at the moment, so they don't tend to be very active in compliancy of protected areas. Anyway, I digress. So I guess yes, there are inherent dangers to kind of having this kind of data wide out there in the open, but I also think on the flip side, again, there is a shared solidarity of the people that are working in the space and participating in the survey that kind of suggests that there is a shared responsibility, that you have these embodied experiences, you have your spiritual moments, and you have to do something with that experience, right? And that in and of itself shifts the knowledge landscape in some way. And kind of creates almost the conditions upon which respect for knowledge can be born. Again, you're flipping the script and saying, actually, let's take accountability ourselves, and a relational kind of accountability that honors not only the people but the place and the other creatures that dwell in place with us. Yeah, I don't know if that.
That's wonderful. And I think that's a really beautiful positive note to end on. Kiri, did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to end on?
No, just thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And I am really keen if anyone is interested in engaging further. You're sitting in the Zoom and you've got some questions or comments. I'd love to engage. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been such a pleasure to be a part of, and I hope you can see how the conversations wove together by the end, in a really beautiful way. Like I say, the value of its knowledge is not consumed by its use will stay with me, as will the structures to support the structures supporting to honor what we've been entrusted with, and also the importance of the systemic issues we've got with the underlying infrastructure. Three really strong and congruent themes that have been really beautiful. So I just want to thank you so much. I know it's tricky when a panel is slightly smaller, there's more pressure, and you've both had such a lot of value to share. And we really, really appreciate you taking the time because we know you're busy with your own mahi. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know we have a slide. Thank you for that. I just want to promote, so this is the second of three. I hope I'm correct in that. Three sessions that Open Access Australasia is putting on for Open Access Week. So we have one more tomorrow. Do encourage you to engage with that. It will be another fantastic talk, as was yesterday's, as was today's, and we really enjoy putting them on for you. So thank you for your engagement. So I am going to close us off with karakia. Kia tauna manaakitanga, ki runga, ki tina o tātou. Kia piki te ora, te kaha me te maramatanga.